Have you ever been judged before you even said a word? Imagine sitting on a bench, enjoying the sunshine, and the next thing you know, you're in handcuffs. That's what happened to Justice Reynolds, a man whose calm demeanor was mistaken for something sinister. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's see how far this story reaches. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because what unfolds next will stay with you long after the video ends. The sun hung low over Riverside Park, casting golden light across the swaying trees and joggers' rhythmic strides. Justice Reynolds sat alone on a weathered bench, flipping a page in his novel. His dark gray blazer was relaxed, his expression even more so, eyes moving steadily between lines of text, occasionally glancing up at children laughing near the swings. It was one of his favorite places in the city, a slice of quiet amid chaos, where he could breathe freely and let his mind drift. But that peace was about to be shattered. Officer Maddox, a seasoned patrol cop with 22 years on the force, scanned the park from across the trail. His boots thudded softly against the pavement, hands loosely resting near his belt. Something felt off. He didn't know what, just a tug in his gut, the kind that had gotten him commendations in the past. His eyes landed on Justice, a black man sitting alone. Calm. Too calm. Maddox slowed his pace. He hadn't seen this guy around before, and something about his composure rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the tailored blazer in a casual park, maybe it was the stillness, but to Maddox, it was suspicious. "What's he doing here?" Maddox muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes. There had been vague reports of a suspect in the area last week, a black male, early 40s, maybe armed. Nothing solid. Still, that was all Maddox needed to walk over. Justice sensed the gaze before he saw the man. Years of training had tuned his instincts sharper than most. He looked up from his book, and his eyes met Maddox's. Calm, focused, unflinching. Justice didn't blink. He'd seen that expression too many times before. A uniformed officer trying to pretend concern wasn't laced with prejudice. He closed his book softly, resting it on his lap, and kept his hands visible. The moment was already charged. One misstep, and the scene could spiral. Maddox's hand tightened slightly around the baton strapped to his side. He didn't like the way the man was looking at him, steady as if he were the one evaluating him. That bothered him. Most people showed some hint of fear. This man didn't. "Afternoon," Maddox said as he stopped at the bench. His voice was clipped, polite enough but with a bite under the surface. "Afternoon," Justice replied evenly, not moving. "You come here often?" Maddox asked, eyes flicking down to the book. He wasn't really interested in an answer. He was fishing, probing. "From time to time," Justice said, with a calm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maddox didn't like the vagueness. "Got some ID on you?" he asked casually, but with his tone growing harder. Justice's smile faded. He knew the dance. He also knew the law. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, voice low and measured. That question tightened the space between them. Maddox bristled. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he said, thumb now resting on his holster. A tension like wire strung too tight pulled the moment forward. Justice drew a slow breath and kept his tone controlled. "I'm just sitting in a park, officer. Is that against the law?" Maddox stepped closer, shadow falling over Justice. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, even though he knew how flimsy the justification was. "And what description is that?" Justice asked, his voice dropping slightly. It wasn't a challenge, not overtly, but it was a line in the sand. Maddox's jaw tightened. He didn't have a real answer, and he knew it. "Don't get smart with me. Show me some ID. Now." For a long beat, the two men stared at each other silent. Around them, the park continued on. Laughter, barking dogs, distant sirens, none of it touching the intensity brewing at that bench. Justice knew he could refuse. He also knew what could happen if he did. He chose compliance, but on his terms. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his inside pocket and retrieved his wallet, handed over his ID. Maddox snatched it. The name meant nothing to him. He was already committed. "Stand up," he ordered. Justice held his gaze, then rose calmly, hands visible. "Turn around." Justice's jaw clenched, but he obeyed. The metal cuffs clicked into place, sharp and final. As Maddox began walking him toward the patrol car, Justice looked around the park. At the stairs, the quiet whispers, the phones raised discreetly. He said nothing, but in his chest a quiet storm had begun to gather. He knew what Maddox didn't. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ride to the 13th District Station was filled with a silence that screamed. Officer Derek Maddox gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, his jaw tight, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. In the back seat, Justice Reynolds sat motionless, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into his wrists, his gaze steady on the world sliding past the window. Trees blurred into buildings, joggers gave way to traffic. The peaceful park now a fading memory. But what Maddox couldn't ignore was that calm, that damn calm. It unsettled him more than any suspect he'd ever cuffed. Most people panicked, pleaded, got angry. Not this guy. This guy just sat there like he knew something Maddox didn't, like he wasn't scared. And that was the part Derek couldn't wrap his head around. "What were you really doing in that park?" Maddox asked abruptly, not turning around. His voice was sharp, too sharp for small talk. Justice's eyes lifted to meet Maddox's in the mirror. "I told you. I was reading." Maddox scoffed, a humorless sound. "A guy like you, reading, in the park." "A guy like me?" Justice repeated evenly. The space between the words was cold steel. Maddox blinked. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Not exactly, but now it hung there, undeniable. He cleared his throat. "You don't look like someone who sits quietly with a book." "What does someone like me look like, officer?" Justice asked, voice soft but cutting. Maddox didn't answer. He couldn't. He focused on the road, the buildings, the red light ahead. Anything but the man behind him. His chest tightened. Something was wrong. Not just with this arrest, but with how this whole thing felt. Still, pride was a stubborn thing, and Maddox had too much of it to admit he might have misjudged the situation. At the precinct, Maddox pulled into the underground lot and exited the car. He opened the rear door, avoiding Justice's gaze as he helped him out of the back seat. Justice moved with measured composure, each step controlled, hands still cuffed behind his back. They walked through the corridor toward processing, the walls echoing their footsteps. Officers passed them, some glancing at Justice with curiosity, others not at all. At the intake desk stood Officer Leo Carter, young, clean-cut, fingers dancing over the keyboard. He looked up and froze for a moment when his eyes landed on Justice. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition? But it vanished just as quickly. "Brought him in from Riverside Park," Maddox said flatly, sliding over the ID. "Acting suspicious." Carter looked at the ID, then at Justice. The name hit him like a whisper in the back of his mind. Reynolds. Justice Reynolds. He'd heard that name in passing. An FBI field office liaison who'd worked with city intelligence units. Highly respected. Not someone you'd just cuff on a hunch. But Carter said nothing. He glanced at Maddox, then back at the monitor, and began typing. "Captain Monroe's in her office," he said after a moment. "You'll want to take him to her." Maddox stiffened. "Now?" "Now." The tone in Carter's voice was neutral, but beneath it there was something else. Urgency, perhaps. Maddox hesitated for a second, then nodded. He grabbed Justice's arm, not roughly, but with just enough pressure to signal control, and began guiding him through the hallway. Justice walked beside him silently, his posture straight, eyes scanning the station. He could sense the tension growing in Maddox. It was in the grip of his hand, the speed of his stride. The cracks were starting to show. When they reached the office door, Maddox knocked once. A voice called from within. "Come in." Inside, Captain Evelyn Monroe sat behind a clean, well-organized desk. Papers stacked with precision. The precinct emblem gleaming on the wall behind her. Her presence was sharp. Sharp eyes, sharp suit, sharp mind. She looked up as they entered, her gaze locking onto Justice first. For a split second, something passed behind her eyes. Recognition. But like Carter, she masked it instantly. "Officer Maddox," she said evenly. "What's this about?" Maddox guided Justice forward. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park. Refused to show ID until pressed. Figured I'd bring him in for questioning." Captain Monroe's eyes narrowed, flicking to the ID in her hand. She turned it over once, then again, then looked at Justice directly. "Mr. Reynolds," she said slowly. "Is that correct?" Justice nodded once. Her eyes sharpened further. She knew. She knew exactly who he was. Maddox, meanwhile, stood ramrod stiff, unaware that the ground beneath him was already crumbling. "Did you have probable cause to arrest him, officer?" Monroe asked, her tone deceptively calm. Maddox hesitated. Just a second. But it was enough. "He wasn't cooperating," he replied, but even he could hear the weakness in his own voice. Monroe set the ID down. "Step outside, officer. I'd like to speak with Mr. Reynolds alone." Maddox blinked. "Captain?" "Outside, now!" The command was final. No room for debate. Maddox released Justice's arm and exited the room, the door clicking softly shut behind him. As silence settled in the office, Monroe's expression shifted. She sighed and looked at Justice with a rare softness. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "I'm sorry for this mess." Justice gave a faint smile. "No apology needed, Captain. You're doing your job. And now I need to do it properly," she said, her eyes flicking to the closed door. "But may I ask, why didn't you tell him who you were?" Justice's smile faded, his voice firm. "Because it shouldn't matter." Captain Evelyn Monroe leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers steepled together as she studied Justice Reynolds across the desk. His words, "because it shouldn't matter," hung in the room like a quiet rebuke, one that spoke not just to Maddox's mistake but to a much larger truth. Monroe nodded, slowly, the gravity of his answer sinking in. "You're right. It shouldn't," she said, voice low. "But we both know it often does." Justice said nothing, but his silence echoed agreement. "I'll speak with Officer Maddox," Monroe added, her tone sharpening again, returning to protocol. "And I assure you, Mr. Reynolds, this will be handled with full transparency. If there's one thing I don't tolerate under my command, it's profiling." Justice inclined his head slightly. "I'm not looking to make headlines, Captain. I just want accountability and change." Monroe stood. "You'll have both. Wait here." She stepped out of the office and found Maddox waiting just outside, arms folded across his chest, brows drawn in frustration and confusion. "Captain," he started, but Monroe cut him off with a raised hand. "In my office. Now." He obeyed, jaw tight, following her back in. Justice remained seated, composed. Monroe stood beside her desk rather than sitting, signaling a shift in tone. "Officer Maddox," she said, eyes locked on his, "do you have any idea who you just arrested?" Maddox blinked. "Some guy acting sketchy in the park?" "Wrong," Monroe snapped. "You just put handcuffs on a federal agent. Special Agent Justice Reynolds, FBI." Maddox froze. His mouth opened, then closed. He stared at Justice, who met his gaze evenly. "You're FBI?" he finally choked out. Justice gave a single nod. "And you didn't think to mention that?" Maddox asked, his voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and defensiveness. "No," Justice replied, calm as ever, "because it shouldn't have mattered." Monroe turned back to Maddox. "But it did, officer. It did matter, to you. You profiled him. You escalated. And now we're here." Maddox sputtered. "I was following instinct. He matched a vague description." "Vague isn't probable cause," Monroe cut in. "You had no solid grounds, and you know it." "Captain, I've been on the job for over 20 years. "Then you should know better." Her voice was steel. "You're on administrative leave effective immediately, pending internal review." Maddox's face paled. "You're suspending me?" "Temporarily," she said. But depending on what this investigation finds, it could go much further." Maddox turned to Justice, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You're really going to ruin my career over this?" Justice stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a show. He simply looked the man in the eye and said, "No, Officer Maddox, you did that." The silence that followed was deeper than anger. Monroe motioned to the door. "Leave your badge with Officer Carter. I'll be in touch." Maddox hesitated, his world shifting beneath his feet, then turned and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. Justice exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Monroe rubbed her temples for a second before sitting back down. "I'm going to initiate a full review," she said. "Witness statements, body cam footage, intake logs, everything." Justice nodded. "Good, and I'll give you a formal statement." "I'd appreciate that," Monroe replied. "It's not just about Maddox. This is a systemic problem, and I don't intend to let it rot under my watch." She opened her drawer and pulled out a thick folder marked Internal Affairs Inquiry. "This department has work to do," she added, more to herself than to him. "If it takes this incident to wake us up, then so be it." Justice glanced toward the window. "Then maybe something good will come out of today." An hour later, the official intake began. Detective Raymond Cole, a senior officer from Internal Affairs, arrived with sharp eyes and a case file already half an inch thick. He spoke little, but he listened to everything. Justice gave a clear, detailed account of the encounter, the initial approach, the tone of Maddox's questioning, the refusal to answer his rights-based questions, and the unnecessary escalation. Cole took notes, nodding now and then, but never interrupting. When Justice finished, Cole closed his notebook. "We'll cross-reference everything," he said. "Witness reports, camera logs, and body cam footage. It's going to be thorough." "I expect nothing less," Justice replied. "And I'll be available if needed." Cole stood. "You may be the reason someone else doesn't have to go through this. That matters." Justice gave a small nod. It did matter. Not because of his badge, not because of his title, but because if someone like him, with power, could be treated like that in broad daylight, what happened to those who didn't have that protection? As he stepped out of the office, the precinct seemed quieter. Eyes followed him, some curious, some ashamed. Officer Leo Carter gave him a slight nod as he passed. Respect, recognition, maybe even regret. Justice paused at the exit, glancing back just once before walking through the doors. The afternoon sun was still out, but the warmth of the park now felt far away. There would be fallout. Headlines, no doubt. Angry meetings, political spin. But Justice wasn't thinking about that yet. Not today. Today, he'd taken the first step toward accountability. And as he walked down the steps into the street, his thoughts were already moving toward what came next, not for himself, but for everyone else who couldn't walk away so freely. Derek Maddox sat at the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it might offer an answer he hadn't already ignored. The apartment was dark, the blinds half drawn, a takeout box untouched on the kitchen counter. The silence was different than at the precinct. This silence pressed, choked, scraped at the corners of his thoughts like fingernails on drywall. His badge was gone, his gun too, turned in like a uniform he no longer had the right to wear. All he had left were questions, and the growing realization that none of his old answers worked anymore. For hours, he replayed the encounter in Riverside Park over and over. The look on Justice Reynolds' face, the calm, the steadiness, the questions. Am I under arrest? Is that against the law? What does someone like me look like, officer? Maddox had shrugged them off at the time. Just another suspect playing games, he told himself. But now, those words echoed differently. Not just challenges to his authority, but reflections of his assumptions, and the way they unraveled him so easily. The next morning, he sat stiffly in the waiting room outside the precinct's internal affairs conference room, dressed in a plain gray shirt and slacks. No uniform, no shield. He felt smaller without them. The walls were too white, the air too sterile. Across from him, a young officer walked past, casting him a glance, 1 part pity, 2 parts judgment. Maddox pretended not to see. The door opened. Detective Raymond Cole stepped out, clipboard in hand. "We're ready for you," he said. Maddox stood slowly, every muscle tight. He followed Cole into the room where the review board sat like judges behind a long table. Captain Evelyn Monroe at the center, flanked by 2 representatives from Internal Affairs and a civilian oversight member with a legal pad. And there, at the far end, sat Justice Reynolds. Again, calm, watchful. His presence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It grounded the room like gravity. Maddox took the empty seat across from them, his throat dry. "Officer Maddox," Monroe began, her voice cool but controlled, "we're here to review the events that occurred 2 days ago involving the detainment of Special Agent Justice Reynolds. Do you understand the purpose of this meeting?" Maddox nodded once. "Yes, Captain." "This is a formal proceeding. We will examine your decision-making, your justification, and the context surrounding your actions. You may respond freely, but you must respond honestly." Maddox swallowed hard. "Understood." Cole began reading from the official statement Maddox had submitted the night of the incident. It sounded different out loud, colder, more defensive, hollowed by the weight of hindsight. "You state that you approached Mr. Reynolds because he was sitting alone and matched a vague suspect description from a week-old report. Is that correct?" "Yes," Maddox said quietly. "Did he exhibit any behavior suggesting criminal activity?" He didn't respond the way I expected. "What does that mean?" asked the civilian board member, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes. "He was too calm," Maddox muttered. "Didn't flinch. Looked me right in the eye." "So you interpreted composure as suspicious?" Maddox paused, caught in the trap of his own logic. "I trusted my instincts." "And those instincts led you to cuff and detain an unarmed federal agent without probable cause," Monroe added. Maddox looked down at the table. "It wasn't personal. I didn't know who he was." "Exactly," Justice said softly, and every head turned toward him. His voice was even, his gaze steady. "You didn't know, and yet you treated me like I was guilty. Why?" Maddox opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no defense, just a cold wall of shame pressing in. Monroe leaned forward. "This board has reviewed body cam footage, witness statements, and your own account. There is no legal or ethical basis for the arrest. You escalated without cause, you violated protocol, and you failed to uphold the standard of this department." Maddox nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "I understand." "This isn't just about policy," the civilian added. "It's about mindset. If you see a black man sitting alone and assume danger, that's not policing. That's prejudice." Another long silence filled the room. Finally, Monroe spoke again. "Officer Maddox, pending final administrative review, you are relieved of duty indefinitely. A recommendation for termination has been submitted." Maddox didn't fight it. For the first time in his career, he didn't try to argue, because deep down, he knew they were right. After the room cleared, Justice approached Monroe privately. "What happens next?" he asked. "The recommendation goes through formal channels," Monroe replied. "But that's just the beginning." Justice raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Change," she said simply. "I've already begun rewriting the bias training modules, and this incident is going to be part of the case study." "You're turning this into a lesson?" he asked. "No," she corrected. "A turning point." That evening, Monroe stayed late in her office, reviewing early drafts of the new department-wide policy updates. Clearer de-escalation procedures, cultural bias assessments, independent civilian reporting options. She paused at the top of the file and wrote in bold, permanent ink, "Preventing another park incident." Meanwhile, Maddox sat in his apartment staring at the closed laptop screen in front of him. For the first time in years, he didn't know what came next. Not just in his career, but in who he was without it. And justice? He sat in his own living room, looking out the window at the city below. the same skyline, the same traffic hum, but something in the air had shifted. The cost of speaking up was steep, but the cost of silence had always been higher, and now the truth was out, not just about Maddox, but about what needed to change, not someday, now. A week later, the precinct was no longer the same. Posters about community engagement now lined the halls. A bulletin board near the front desk listed upcoming workshops, recognizing implicit bias, de-escalation in the field, voices from the community. The tone of conversation among officers had changed. Lower, more deliberate, as if everyone understood the gravity of what had unfolded and didn't yet know how to speak about it out loud. Justice Reynolds stood at the edge of the main hallway, watching a young officer pin up a flyer for a new mentorship initiative. No uniform, no clipboard, just presence. A quiet influence that reached deeper than rank. Captain Evelyn Monroe stepped out of her office to greet him, holding a thick folder in her hands. "It's official," she said. "Maddox has been terminated. The review board's vote was unanimous." Justice nodded once. "Was he here to receive it in person?" "He's coming by today," Monroe replied, her tone careful, "to collect his things. I wanted someone from the department to be here, not for confrontation, just closure." Justice looked down the corridor. "I'll stay." Across the city, Derek Maddox sat in his parked car in front of the 13th District Station, staring at the brick facade like it had betrayed him. Or maybe like he had betrayed it. His hands gripped the steering wheel, not out of tension but from a kind of quiet dread. He wasn't the man who had walked into this building 2 weeks ago with a badge and certainty. That man had been stripped down, by process, by truth, by consequences he never thought would reach him. He picked up the cardboard box beside him and stepped out of the car, his footsteps slow but steady. Inside, the station felt colder. Officers gave him sidelong glances, some out of sympathy, others out of something closer to relief. There was no ceremony, no grand exit. Just Maddox walking into the locker room and gathering his few personal items. A framed photo, a coffee mug, a pair of worn gloves. When he turned to leave, Justice was standing by the exit. The two men locked eyes. For a moment, no one moved. No crowd gathered, no cameras rolled. Just two men in the quiet gravity of a mistake that had changed both of their lives. Maddox looked down, then back up. "Agent Reynolds," he said softly. Justice offered a nod. "Maddox, I came to say—" He paused, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed or hollow. "I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't think I deserve much grace, but I do want to understand, and I want to be better, even if it's not as a cop anymore." Justice studied him for a moment. "That's a start." Maddox nodded slowly. "You could have ruined me, but you didn't. You did that yourself," Justice said, not cruelly, just truthfully. "But you also showed up. That's more than some ever do." Maddox let the words settle. He didn't reply, just gave a quiet nod and walked past him, out the door, into a world where he would have to rebuild from the ground up. Justice turned and found Monroe watching from a distance. She approached with a curious look. "You didn't have to stay." "I did," Justice said. "Sometimes people need to see the results, see it through." Monroe handed him the folder she'd been carrying. "This is the draft proposal. Bias training overhaul, accountability metrics, community feedback channels. I'd like your input before we finalize." Justice flipped through the pages, impressed. "You're not wasting time." "We can't afford to," she said. "The reputation of this department isn't just on the line, it's being rewritten." Justice closed the folder. "I'll help you shape it, but it has to be real, not just PR." "It will be," she promised. "Not perfect, but real." Over the next few days, Justice met with recruits, gave talks, shared his story. Not as a warning, but as a tool. He watched young officers shift in their seats, some uncomfortable, some wide-eyed. He spoke about perception, restraint, and the cost of unchecked assumption. One of them, A Latina officer in her 20s raised her hand. "How do we undo years of conditioning?" she asked. "You start by questioning what you've accepted as normal," Justice replied, "and you stop letting fear decide for you." Outside, life went on. Sirens blaring, radios crackling, another shift change rolling in, but something beneath the surface had shifted. A new standard was being set, not with slogans, but with choices, one by one. Later that week, Justice returned to Riverside Park. Same bench, same breeze. This time, he wasn't reading. He just sat quietly, watching families picnic, kids play tag, dogs chase sticks. A place that had once been the scene of humiliation now felt different. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had reclaimed it. A little girl in a purple dress tripped near his bench, her ball rolling to his feet. Justice picked it up and handed it back with a warm smile. Her mother nodded gratefully from a distance. Small, human moments. They were the point. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Justice stood and began walking toward the exit. His phone buzzed. A message from Captain Monroe. "New hire orientation next Friday. You in?" He smiled. "Absolutely," he typed. Then paused. "Let's build something better." And, as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he knew this wasn't the end. Not of the story, not of the fight. It was simply the beginning of the version of law enforcement that should have existed all along. One that saw people before assumptions, justice before power. The version worth fighting for.